of everything from a pedagogical standpoint before moving on to step 2. I don't do 100% of everything at step 2 before I go to step 3. There are some pieces that the amount of time spent in these areas is not going to be the same, and that is perfectly okay. For example, if you're teaching out of a particular method book, it doesn't matter what method book that you're using with first or second year students, and you're choosing to do some score study, which I hope you do, you're probably here in the harmonic piece, and it's all unison and octaves. You're done. You don't have to keep inventing a bunch of different analytical techniques if it's pretty clear this is what's happening, if that makes sense. So don't, when I was particularly a younger teacher, I felt very conscripted to do everything 100% all the way through. And then I realized some pieces just don't demand that. Some pieces you don't need to, yes, you need to go through all these steps, but the amount of time and effort and analyzation that goes in each of these steps is going to be different depending on the piece. Hence why there's an infinite distance between 0 and 1. I'm going to use these two pieces to explain and or use as examples for the different steps here. Colonial Song by Percy Granger and the Divertimento for Band by Persichetti. Those are definitely standard rep pieces that I hope all of you had the experience to play. I know the symphonic band is playing the Australian upcountry tune, which is essentially a version of Colonial Song. So let's go through each of these steps. Pedagogical. This is how we use our pedagogy, our knowledge of teaching, to inform our score study. And this has a couple of different avenues to it. This first one is very simply, do you select a piece to program? How do you do that? If you say, no, not this year, guess what? That's the end of the score study on that particular piece. Okay? But on the other hand, if you're thinking critically about, yeah, I really want to perform this piece, and I think it'll be really enriching for my students, and I have all the right people in all the right chairs, then those are portions of the decision as to whether or not you program a particular piece. You commit to the piece, in other words. Here's another step. I've been married for 22 years to my sweet wife, Rebecca, who's the director of the Honors College at A-State. And it took me about 21 years and 4 months to really understand, when she would say, you're putting together that thing wrong from IKEA. Or, if you would just read the instructions, things would go a lot better. And of course, I didn't want to believe that. Then when I finally started buying into that philosophy, I said, oh yeah, things do go better when we read the instructions. And so when we have a score, we understand it better and faster if we take time to read all the words and symbols and understand exactly what they mean before we start. Because if we don't understand, how do we expect our students to understand? So knowing all the words, knowing all the symbols. So, let's take an example here. You decide that you're going to program the Persichetti Divertimento for band. And this is an exact replica of the condensed score that you can get from the fifth movement. I want you to take about 30 seconds or so to give that a once-over. And then, from a pedagogical standpoint, what are some pitfalls? What are some things you're going to have to worry about? What are some things that you're going to have to be mindful of when you decide yes or no in terms of performing this piece? Something that you might want to be very aware of or pay some specific attention to before you're like, yep, that's going in the folder, or vice versa. Yeah. The tempo. And what is concerning about the tempo? It's very slow. Okay, so what does that mean for, let's say, a younger ensemble? Possibly. Also endurance too, as far as do they have, the embouchure support and other, breath support to facilitate music making at that tempo? Okay, good answer. Anybody else?
Accidentals.
Accidentals. There are a lot. And to be fair, in this particular piece, there are no key signs. So everything is going to be through an accidental. But yes, you know, when you see all those accidentals, the threat level goes up just a little bit when you see all those accidentals, okay? Anything else?
The measure numbers don't line up with the phrases.
Not at all, okay? And that's something that in an older piece like this, that was often the case. They would put measure numbers for convenience every 5 or 10 as opposed to what would make sense intuitively from a musical standpoint.
The dynamics are going to tax endurance.
Anyone else?
I'm thinking maybe like balance and then blend between like the saxophone and the climax and the core areas.
Okay. All true. This is the first thing that I notice. Exactly. And it doesn't necessarily say in here solo, but you look at this line that's all cornet, and you're like, oh, that's pretty rangy. That's a major 10th from here to this G. And look how long it is. And this is only the first 20 measures. If you had the entire movement in front of you, you'd be like, oh yeah, I've got to have a pretty confident player in that chair to be able to play this movement. That's the first thing that I notice. And that doesn't mean that other things that you noticed are right or wrong or vice versa, but I know in my estimation of whether or not to program this piece, if I don't have a trumpet player that can play that solo, I probably don't program this piece. Now, pause. You might be saying, well, what if we don't program that movement? It's a 6-movement piece. What if we don't program that movement? Fine, I have no problem with that. I can understand that. No problem. That's your choice. That's a pedagogical preference and a philosophical preference. That's fine. I tend to be, my own philosophy is, if you're going to put something in the folder, I tend to be an all or nothing kind of person. If you're going to program the piece, you're going to program the whole piece. Okay? So, that's just an example, and there are many. Everybody who contributed something, all of that is exactly right. That's just one thing when you're considering whether or not to program a piece, pedagogically. So, the next thing, historical and biographical information. This is where it can be, the internet now makes this so much easier than it used to be, where you can literally Google anyone, sometimes in a creepster sort of way, but you can literally, Google anyone and find out, information. And it's so much easier than ever before to reach out to composers who are living and have conversations and interactions with them. But when we're talking about historical and biographical information, these are the essential questions, kind of the 5, who, what, where, when, why, and I was 5, who, what, where, why. Yep. Those are the questions. Now, think for a moment about if you were going to program something, your curiosity has to take over here. Pick one of those 5 things. It doesn't matter what piece, it could be any piece. But pick one of those 5 things, and I'm going to ask you to pose a question, sort of like Jeopardy. I'm going to get on my Alex Trebek here. And I'm going to ask you to pose a question that if you were score studying any particular piece, you would want to know. For example, who is the composer? Okay? So pick one of those 5, and think about the question that you would want to pose through your curiosity and study of the historical and background information for the piece. You've got one, I can tell.
What's the meaning behind the piece?
What is the meaning behind the piece? Okay, if there is one. Okay, assuming there is one. Back here. Of course.
Why did they
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Why did they do it?
Why did they write the piece? Okay. Sometimes it's because they got paid to. Sometimes it's because they have a contract to a publishing house, and the publishing house says you have to write X number of pieces a year. Sometimes it was inspiration, but it would be good to know that.
What influences in that person's life may have led to them having a certain writing style that appears in the piece?
Okay, absolutely.
What era was written?
Or even more specifically, when. Like what year and when in the composer's output. Good.
What's your imagery behind the music?
influenced your style, or who influenced your melody?
Exactly. All those are perfectly valid questions. And I think from a score study standpoint, our curiosity has to take over here just a little bit. Now, I'll give you a slightly different example. I've done colonial song a couple of different times with an ensemble. And I'm ashamed to admit, and I'll admit this among friends, I'm ashamed to admit that I saw on the score that there were 5 different versions of colonial song. Being the young and not curious enough music teacher that I was, I sort of adopted this kind of attitude about, I don't care about those other versions, they're not the version I'm doing. And then when I took the time to listen to the other versions, I was like, wow, I have missed out. And I felt bad for the students that I had conducted previously, that I was not able to inform from a musical perspective that, after hearing what I'm about to play for you, completely changed my musical perspective on this particular piece, 180 degrees. So on colonial song, there's versions for band, versions for orchestra, piano, violin and cello and piano, and then this particular version, violin, cello, piano, soprano, and tenor. And I want you to check this out. We'll listen to probably a good chunk of this, because this also informs what we're going to talk about here in a little bit. This is actually like volume 14 of a whole series of chamber works and just every work that Percy Granger did. And when you're dealing with a composer like Granger, it's important to know all the different versions, because he wrote lots of different versions of the same piece. And so I felt, like I said, I felt ashamed as a music educator when I had not done my due diligence. Because after hearing this, the way that I approached the piece was completely different. Now, to be fair, there are things that string players and vocalists can do that wind players can't do or can't do as easily. So it's not going to be exactly the same as far as my interpretation, but this was heavily influenced. Going forward now, I've done colonial song a couple of times since then. And it's just like, I wish I had known that from the beginning. I wish I had done my due diligence on the background of that piece. So we get into step 3. Formal analysis. This, in my point of view, is the secret to rehearsal efficiency. We all have, we want to be as efficient as possible in our rehearsals. But this, to me, is the secret of being efficient in our rehearsals. My teacher at the Florida State University was, one of them was Dr. Jim Croft. And he had a saying, he was a wonderful human being. And one of his favorite sayings was this. And his reason for saying that was very simply, if you know how something is put together, you can take it apart, work with it, put it back together, and hopefully be way more efficient as a rehearsal technician. But you have to understand the form of it and understand how it puts together, or how it's put together, the architecture of the piece. Sometimes this also includes a survey of the dynamic content and maybe even the rhythmic content if that's appropriate enough. For example, I can imagine if you were teaching at a middle school level and you had not introduced, I'm just making something up here, the concept of dotted 8/16ths. You'd want to know, hey, how many of those are in this piece? So you just do a quick little survey, hey, 1 or 2 or whatever, and that way you know, hey, these are problematic things, and this also informs your rehearsal techniques and your rehearsal strategies. So, colonial song, we use this example again, but, and I have to say this, maybe this is different in New Mexico, but every place I've ever presented a clinic, we start talking about form of a piece when it comes to wind band music, and inevitably, I get this response. ABA? That's all ABA. Well, to a certain extent, that's true. And a lot of the music that is being, unfortunately, from my point of view, purchased and consumed without a lot of, thought as to an evaluation of really what's the purpose of it, the structure of it. A lot of times it literally is A, B with a DC repeat, back to A, and then a coda. Now, I'm not saying that music that's ABA with a DC repeat is bad. Hello, whole second suite. Okay? C songs, Ray Vaughan Williams. I'm not saying that that music is bad. What I am saying is this. When you're looking at the form of a piece, it's not always going to be ABA. Conversely, many of you in your form and analysis classes, if you had a form and analysis class, or if you had theory classes or history classes, you heard terms like sonata allegro, or you heard terms like rondo, or sonata rondo, or theme and variations. There are wind band pieces that strictly adhere to those forms, but a lot of times they don't. Exhibit A, the colonial song. From my point of view, there's an introduction, an A-B section, developmental interludes, return to A and a coda. So when I'm dealing with the form of a piece, one of the things I always find helpful is to know where the phrases start and stop. And I use this little mark in the score frequently, where I make a little caret like this, and then the number inside the caret tells me the phrase length. Susan Marches, for example. If you were to look at a score that I have for a Susan March, you'd see a lot of that over and over and over and over again. Because most Susan Marches, most marches in general, are 4-measure phrases. So you'd see a lot of that. On the other hand, this is the intro to Colonial Song again. You can see the question there. That's the end of the introduction. Take a second and just in the privacy of your own thoughts, how many phrases do you think are there? And then when you feel like you've answered that question, then what's the length of the phrases? I'll throw you a bone. That's where the first phrase starts. Raise your hand if you think there's only one phrase here. Good, thank you. One phrase?
One phrase.
One phrase, okay. How many people think there's 2 phrases? Show of hands. I'll be confident. There you go. 3 phrases. Okay, got some people on the fence maybe. 4 phrases. Okay, that seems to be the majority opinion. 5 or more phrases. Okay, let's listen to it again. It's short. By the way, there is no right or wrong answer here. Some of you, particularly students, are like, he's asking us a question and we're having to figure out the answer. One of the things I learned very quickly in doing this is that if you can justify your decisions, more often than not, fine. If there's a musically supported reason as to what leads you to a particular decision, fine. I assure you that the Granger police are not going to come by and haul you off in a zip tie if, for example, you say, oh, there's only 1 phrase here at the introduction, or there's 12 phrases at the introduction. That's not going to happen. But what should happen is, what are your musical rationales for this? What's the evidence that leads you to this conclusion? Let's listen to this one more time.